Okay, great. So it's 7 o'clock, and first of all, I would like to thank the organizers to sort of organize this talk on making sense of early Buddhist logic, which is to be given by Mr. Syed Nizar. So many thanks to you, Mr. Syed, for coming here and for sharing your knowledge in this talk. To introduce first of all myself, I am a member of a society in Nalanda, and I'm doing a PhD in mathematics and philosophy at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. And with me on the screen is Mr. Syed Nizar, who is a very dear friend of mine. And Syed ji grew up in Bangladesh before studying in the UK at the University of Manchester, where he completed a BA with honors in philosophy and social sciences and an MSc in mathematical logic and the theory of computation. He's currently in the final stages of writing his doctoral dissertation on an ancient form of Eastern reasoning called Chatushkoti. Nizarji has been teaching philosophy at Jahangirnagar University since 2009, where he is currently an assistant professor, and he has served on the University Academic Council for quite some time. Additionally, he has worked at the University of Canterbury as a teaching assistant, the University of Asia Pacific, and Prague University in Dhaka. And Nizarji has published a number of journal articles on aspects of Indian logic and philosophy, and a number of conferences as well. And he has published a book as well on this topic. Nizarji is currently working on a number of papers that are linked to history and philosophy of Buddhist logic, particularly Chatushkoti. And if I could briefly discuss Chatushkoti or Buddhist logic before Seiji begins his talk. Usually when we think of logic, the first thing that comes to mind is the Western context of logic, which is that logic are rules of inferences, are rules of debating, and it is not widely known that Indians, including the Nyaya school and the Buddhists, had developed a sophisticated style of reasoning, of drawing inferences and conducting debates based on some very solid core principles, which then were later solidified as rules of logic. One of these schools was led by Nagarjuna, who was a prominent philosopher, one of the tallest figures in Buddhist philosophy, and he developed what is called the Chatushkoti, or the fourfold system of logic, about which we're going to have a very scholarly and yet general look by Nizarji. And Nizarji's talk is going to focus not only on the philosophical aspects of it, but more importantly on the historical aspects of this logic and how the logic actually came to be. So before wasting any of your time, I would like to hand over the floor to Nizarji, and please take it away. And thank you very much for coming here, and it's a pleasure to have you here on this talk.
Thank you, Aditya, for such a kind introduction, and also thanks for giving a heads up into the topic, actually. And I also like to thank Buddhist Heritage Research Institute for having me here, and Dr. Anantashutosh, and also Mr. Azad for organizing that, actually. So just to start with, actually, and as Aditya was mentioning, that logic, in many ways, we think that is kind of like study of reason, argument, and inference in some form. And there's a big difference between our informal use of reasoning and formal study of reasoning. Informal reasoning is very organic. It has a very diverse range of argumentation. And over recently, like the computer scientists, as well as philosopher and mathematician, they are becoming interested in formalizing the informal reasoning. For AI, one of the particular reason, and also linguistical and philosophical aspect too. On the other hand, basically, for centuries, actually, we have been studying logic in an academic environment. And our academic study of logic is very narrow and confined. Especially like it is highly influenced and dominated by the Western mainstream logic, and which has a deep root in Aristotle in many ways. And it has some basic character. And there are two basic characters, actually. One of them that some things can be true or false, but cannot be both together. So this is the one, and there is nothing in between either. So these are a kind of like very intuitive and trivial in many ways to us nowadays, actually, because we are kind of familiar with basically Aristotle's concept of principle of non-contradiction and principle of excluded middle. So the basic and mainstream idea is that we got true and false and nothing in between and can't be both together. That's a basic idea. But here in 6th century BC in Magad, perhaps I should say in Greater Magad, we see a very bizarre sort of reasoning. And there basically not only true and false has been considered, parallelly true and false both, and we also got another position, neither true nor false. And most of all, you can basically deny all of them. And this system is very bizarre and strange from a Western point of view, despite of the fact that now Western academia is becoming more pluralistic than ever before. But this system, like having 4 alternative, like true, false, both, and neither. So we got like 4 corners. So it's a 4 corners in Sanskrit, usually Chatush, and Koti is corner. So Chatush Koti is coming from that word. So the system is called Chatush Koti. It's very much basically clear from the like description and the name. The word actually, even though the system we kind of see in the early Buddhist canon, in Pali Nikaya and as well as Sanskrit canons too, in 6th century BC. But the word first time used by Nagarjuna in Ochintan Stopa in the 2nd century. So there's a huge time frame in between. We got 6th century or around that period, depending on basically how we do the timelines. And we got, on the other hand, that in 2nd century, someone is naming it. So, in between, there are another 2 names has been used to refer to this idea, but never been popularized. And that is Chatur Satta in Pali literature, you will see, or Chatur Vidya. But these are more from like referring to basically like 4 as a position actually, or 4 truth. But the more popular version, and usually nowadays we named actually, which is many ways influenced by the Nagarjuna, and that is Chatushkoti. But the Chatushkoti also appeared in conjunction with another word is called Chatushkoti Binirmukta. Mukta means liberated. We're all familiar with this word, and Binirmukta is basically liberation from 4 corners. So when basically someone is denying all 4, that is called liberation from 4 corners, and that is called Chatushkoti Binirmukta. So what I'm going to do today actually is discuss about briefly what is Chatushkoti, what are the contexts where it's coming from, and reason for originate, and also kind of like how it has traveled most of the connected world. Ironically, is that despite of basically is not highly acknowledged in the contemporary academia, this system has traveled most of the connected world and in the ancient world, and even before the Aristotelian system. So that's another interesting aspect of this system. So I'll just briefly mention how the system has traveled different part of the world, and also later on basically how and that present Western academia usually perceives it and how to make sense of it. So this is how I'm gonna actually discuss about. So just to start with, actually, those who we are familiar with the Buddhist philosophy and Buddhism as a religion, we know that Buddha or Siddhartha or even like remain silent in number of questions, and Pali canons usually list 10 questions that usually Buddha remains silent. And those 10 questions are kind of a important topic for discussion. I just shared on my slide. is that like whether like the world in here is local. It has a very particular connotation and it's very difficult to confine it to the world, but just to use it. So is whether world is eternal or non-eternal. That's the first question. Second question is like whether basically world is finite or infinite. And the second set actually, and third actually is talking about basically whether jiva and ajib, like living element and non-living element, they are identical or not. These are kind of like highly discussed questions in ancient India in philosophical environment. But the last four question has a very strange pattern. The pattern we were talking about is that like does Tathagata, like the enlightened person, lives after death? Does he not lives after death? Does he both lives and doesn't lives after death? And he neither lives nor doesn't lives after death. So that's kind of a first example of this sort actually we came across in the early Polycanons actually. But the list has expanded over the period of time. Like when we look at this is a Pali list actually. If we look at the Sanskrit list, because we know that in Buddhist canon, like despite of the fact that a long time has been told that Buddha has spoken in Pali language, but from the Ashok's inscriptions, now we know basically the places Buddha has traveled is largely the dialect down there is Old Magdi, and probably the early canon was in Old Magdi. The Pali is more often basically the formalized standard lingua franca for early Buddhist scholars, as well as basically Emperor Ashok's administrative job, most probably, and which has flourished in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and other countries in subsequent period. So the canon actually, the compilation of the canon that had started after the death of Buddha. But despite of the fact, basically, sometimes it has been told that some of the suttas has been suttas in Pali and sutras in Sanskrit, just to clarify. Suttas has been like composed during the time of Buddha in his later life and has been recited in front of him. But we don't know the authenticity of that. But we know the canonical period has started actually after his true and basically massive conference, which is we call it Shangati. And subsequent period actually, over the period of time, basically it remained as in basically oral tradition. The oral tradition always basically very fluid, and it always basically adapts stuff actually over the period of time. So the writing culture, actually, writing down this canon has started quite late. In Sri Lankan chronicles, which is basically kind of helped us to understand the history of ancient India quite a lot. It's like Dipabangsha and Mahabangsha. The text is Dipabangsha is written around 3rd or 4th century, Common Era. So that can Dipabangsha usually mention that the writing culture, manuscript producing has started basically end of 1st century, probably around 89 BCE, between 77 BCE, around that period. There is a lots of debate about the time frame of that in Avagiri in Sri Lanka. So that's the writing culture have started. But people has considerable doubt. People think that it might be at the beginning of the first era, because the time when the Avagiri Bihar was established, within a short period of time, the whole writing project was started. It's too early to start this such a massive project, but we'll leave this aside for the time being. Similarly, basically, we recently, for a long time, we are kind of like our understanding of early Buddhist canon is we only studied basically Pali. Over the last 50, 60 years, like we came across all new materials. Like we found basically Sanskrit, certain portion of Sanskrit agams in Gilgit, which has been published over. And also a significant portion we have discussed after the Afghan war, actually, in Gandhari manuscript in Afghanistan, which and after the carbon rating, which has been done, basically Richard Solomon and some others, And we came to know that the manuscripts are basically some portion of it has written in 1st century, some portion is written far more later, few centuries later. So now we know basically that in terms of written culture, actually, they are fairly like close time within the proximity. But another important aspect is that, like, if we consider basically that if the Buddha and other people have spoken in Old Magdi, then there's a considerable amount of Magdi, Old Magdi traces, dialectical traces we will find in Polycanon, which also can help us basically to detect basically the early canons too. And I think like some of us familiar with this sort of studies like linguistical to find out the early sections of the canon actually. Regardless of that, basically we got to like settings. So here what happened that in the Pali, we have basically only one example of basically Chatushkoti in this sort of form actually, standard form. On the other hand, like which is basically in the list of Obakita question, like the unanswered question by Buddha. In Sanskrit list, actually, a Sanskrit Dirgham, which is translated in Chinese and which is currently fully available, actually, which kind of a list basically 16 questions, and all of them has a Chatushkoti form. But we know basically that some of the Sanskrit text has been translated in Chinese in the 4th century Common Era. And and also basically that around that period, and there isn't likely to be that over the period of time that some of the question has been added up, like one of the important commentarial text called Milanda Puna, which is written in the Minanda was a Greco-Macedonian Indian king, actually has ruled Gandhar around that region, and he sometimes debated with one of the Buddhist monks called Negation, and they're kind of a they are basically within a debate. Actually, the list of questions has been mentioned. Only two additional questions in terms of Pali text. Those are actually like the extra two is that whether world is both finite and non-finite, and neither finite or non-finite. And Milanda has ruled around basically 1st century BC, around that area, or 1st century, 2nd century BC, around that period. And the text was written between 1st century to 2nd century Common Era. So we can make a guess basically by that time there's an additional one more example has been added up. And then subsequent period, basically we got other examples. So when we see Nagarjuna in the 2nd century, we see basically he's extensively using Chatushkoti as a philosophical method, but as some form of like logical sense of that basically of Chatushkoti, due to that reason the extra question has been added over the period of time, is probably like it kind of they feel that basically the sense of logic that it should be basically 4 alternative there. So the sense of Chatushkoti is kind of a like predate as in like in between that period was kind of a present, like between this time of after the death of Siddhartha to the Nagarjuna. Just to clarify, even though I went to that too detail, I shouldn't have, but I think probably like those who are kind of interested can get into that this discussion. So moving on to the basically that what is the nature of basically that question and what had happened. So when basically like in number of sutras actually, which is listed as unanswered questions, and sometimes like Poribrajak or sometimes Ajivikas, or sometimes someone unidentified people encounter Buddha and ask these 10 questions or like more than that actually. And they usually ask basically like the Kimnobo Gautam, like dear Gautam, that is like Tathagata Hoti Paramarana, like is the Tathagata actually lives after death? Or the second, in response to that, Buddha actually said it by saying Nako Aham or Mako Aham. Ma is basically like the Vedic particles means no. Now we all use actually most of the Indic language we use as an negative particles is no. So he's saying basically no, it is not so. And similarly, when he was basically whether Tathagata doesn't live after death, he also responded no. And after that, actually, when Bhatchagata or basically someone else who is asking that question asks, is Tathagata lives and doesn't live after death? He again said basically, no. And then basically he has, does it basically neither lives nor doesn't live after that Tathagata? Then he again says, Siddharth, no. So it's a bit puzzling in many ways, actually. Firstly, like how to make sense of it. Like if you say basically, if I say basically, are you in this room? If I say no, it means that I'm outside the room. And on the other hand, if I said that basically, are you outside the room? If I said no, then it means that probably I'm somewhere else. It could be one of the, if this really inside room and outside room is that these two position, a possible position, then I'm inside the room actually. So it's kind of a bit puzzling that area. But before getting into that puzzle actually and how to solve that problem, and I just like to make you basically given like example how these four alternatives works. So it's like in first four alternatives of the Chatushkoti. That like suppose we got a basically glass with an full of water. So the first koti basically is the glass has a full like the water in it full. The second alternative will be the glass is empty of water. It doesn't have water. It's empty. Glass is empty. Glass has water. Third alternative would be basically the half, like glass of water and does half water, half fill and half not fill. Then the fourth alternative, how to make sense of it, like neither half fill nor neither have water nor have water or doesn't have water. One of the way of making sense for the time being, because it has a like lots of logical way of explaining that, would be basically that glass might have cork, so it neither half filled nor full filled nor basically empty. So that could be the one of the way. And then when Siddharth is rejecting all that, it could be basically that there is no such a thing as glass at all. So this is one way of making sense of it actually, but that would be like one way. There could be a number of ways that has been approached. So just so how that Chatushkoti actually structured together is just to give a basically we got basically like Koti 1 is a true and the Koti 2 is a false only. Then we got both true and false, and we got neither, and the rejection or denial of all. That's the model of actually Chatushkoti, Binirmukta, and Chatushkoti is the four corner. So this is so just to repeat that Chatushkoti is actually that the four corner of anything logically can have a four corner. And the rejection of four corner is Chatushkoti Binirmukta, and just the current slide you can just make a sense out of it. But this bizarre system ironically has traveled quite a lot of the area right after the death. So we know basically that in Alexander has invaded the Archimedean Empire and came all the down to the earth, actually like Pakistan and present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan around that area. So that so the Kandahar was basically Afghanistan and Pakistan around that area. So the Buddhism has reached to Kandahar probably right after the Buddha's death. There is a lot of debate about that basically, but for the time being we'll leave it aside. After death, and from there basically we came to know when Alexander has basically reached to India. That time basically there's a like number of philosophers also came with him, according to Alexander's biographers, and among them actually that Pharaoh, the skeptic, the Greek renowned skeptic, and also Aristotle's nephew Aristophanes. And one of the renowned text on Greek philosophy is that basically Diogenes Lysias has written in the 3rd century, the book called basically Lives and Opinion of the Eminent Philosopher. He mentioned that the Pharaoh has learned philosophy from basically Indian Meji. The word Meji has a very particular connotation, and naked ascetics. So it's kind of like we are getting basically some information that basically that Pharaoh is coming to the India and came to know about that actually, and it appears basically one of the Pharaoh's basically follower and student has basically mentioned that Pharaoh sometimes said that nothing is more true, nor more false, nor both more true and false, nor neither true nor false. So it's kind of a very much echo with basically that our Chatushkoti form of reasoning in many ways. So we can have a basically idea that basically the Chatushkoti has traveled from the Gandhara to Greece, very early period, within few centuries after the death of Buddha, around during the time of even Aristotle. On the other hand, actually, it has traveled to the through Silk Road, has traveled to the China and Japan too. So one of the renowned Chinese commentator and also an important philosopher too, actually, Kumarajiva, he actually came to the Kashmir to learn Mullah Sarvastivadin interpretation of Buddhism, and he has learned there. On the way back, actually, he kind of get familiar with the basically Nagarjuna's writing and Madhyamika and Pragya all this material in the 4th century Common Era, 200 years after the death of Nagarjuna. He kind of started a long translation project in Kashgar, and that during that translation project, actually, he has translated quite a lot of Mullah Sarvastivadin text, early Buddhist canon, actually, and also actually translated lots of Madhyamika text, actually, and along with basically those texts, they have for obvious reason that we see that some of the basically Chatushkoti, example of Chatushkoti became basically some of the Chinese commentator familiar with. And one of his students who has also worked under him, he actively used Chatushkoti, actually, and who is basically a very important figure of Sanlum tradition, Sanlum Zen tradition, actually, Senjo. So Senjo kind of we see in the end of the 5th century, middle of the 5th century, using Chatushkoti at the same time. So kind of like the system is traveling from from Mogot to Gandhar, Gandhar to one side is to the east is Greece. Probably I tried to investigate actually along the basically Persian bloc, but I couldn't find enough evidence like someone used the Chatushkoti or not. But we found basically someone used Chatushkoti in Greece, so it has traveled along that area. On the other hand, in Kashgar to basically toward the mainland China, basically the idea gradually started to emerge. In the 12th century, we see in Japan, actually, Dozong kind of used actively Chatushkoti at the same time. So it's very interesting. One side basically is going to the eastward, another side is going to the westward. So the idea is traveling. Just bearing in mind, basically, around that time when Aristotelian logic didn't even travel to the basically so far as to the Japan. But Chatushkoti has already traveled, and some people are actively using it as a philosophical method. But just one thing, just to tell you, in the early uses of Chatushkoti, we see basically in a debate form, like someone is asking questions, Siddhartha, and Siddhartha is responding. But there's a very interesting aspect, basically using it as a philosophical method. First, we see in the Pharaoh's writing the material we came across, and then subsequently we find in Nagarjuna's writing that he is also using it as a method, and then we find basically that the Sanlum tradition is using also Dajong, actually the Zen tradition, Japanese Zen tradition, they are also using it as a method. But is there any basically influence? Some of the Greeks, like the European scholar, appear to claim that Nagarjuna probably have came to know about this material, actually, that there's a philosophical use of Chatushkoti in Greece and some of the basically Roman scholar, and he has learned from that. It is not likely, because the method he has used and the content he is using is very much connected with the Indian tradition. So it's highly unlikely, just to point that out. So now we got basically that it has traveled to the Greece and also Japan. Around 9th century, the translation project started in Tibet. But around, I think basically 15th century, Gorompa, probably like Aditya would know the pronunciation better because I have some difficulties in pronouncing like Tibetan scholar's name. Gorompa has used actually Chotushkuti in a very unique way. So we see basically there's like lots of uses and of the Chotushkuti in many ways. So during the time, and it has traveled quite a lot of places. But in the 15th century, where it is going to the Tibet and subsequent, like lots of scholars are using, and one of the significant reason is behind it, the Nagarjuna and to interpret his method, philosophy and other stuff. At the same time, the idea actually that also basically becoming familiarized with the newly European scholar and how they have looked at it, that's another interesting aspect. And that will explain basically why such an, despite why we find this system kind of a bizarre. Is that something that how we look at it? And secondly, like why academician has a basically kind of a rigidity to accept it as a like form of reasoning? What is the deep reason behind that? And how to make sense out of it? Eventually, I'll just cover that. So we know basically that Vasco da Gama, who came to India in southern India actually, in early the European scholar, because during the Greek time, we know basically that there is a naval communication between Greece and southern India and India actually, and we have seen basically that some of the captains, like naval captains, Greek naval captains, diary and other stuff, which is a communication. But during the Crusade in Middle Age, actually, the connection kind of deteriorated and stopped, both naval and in many ways through the Silk Route too. So that there is a certain form of disconnection with the European community. And but however, in Europe actually that the early when the European came to the India actually they have less interest about this sort of material. They became interested with the connected with the Jesuit, which is in the middle of the 16th century. Jesuit is a Dominican order established in Paris, and their headquarters was in Rome. So the Jesuit was basically one of the group actually, which was motivated to collect knowledge from all over the world, and they have played a very important role to collect information and the loss of manuscript. So one of the early manuscript basically went to the Louis, the Buddhist manuscript went to the Europe actually is during the Louis XIV time actually. These manuscripts are from Thai and Cambodian manuscript around 330, and they are currently in French archive, and I try access them for my research. So these are the first actually like manuscript went down there, but they have very little interest and in many ways basically unfamiliar with the Chotushkuti during that time due to that disconnectivity. But what happened, even though basically that we know that when the East India Company received the Devani in the 1765 actually, and they have a greater like access to the manuscript, Indian manuscript actually. Even that time, basically, the European scholar wasn't familiar with the like Chotushkuti. European scholar became familiar with Chotushkuti far more later, early 20th century. But just to tell you, actually, despite of the fact that in the when William Jones given established Asiatic Society and give a talk on basically that the Sanskrit, Persian, and the certain form of Latin and Greek has like some form of affinity, and eventually we know that Max Muller come up with basically like the linguistical connectivity actually and comparative linguistics and other stuff. So during that time, basically, when William James said that actually that we have a like connection between the language between Sanskrit and also some of the European language, that time the huge interest has grown. And even there's one of the school actually in the German phonic world actually, they became interested in like so much in the Indian like stuff actually. That time they usually call that movement actually that Oriental Renaissance. Like So there's a huge interest in the Oriental Renaissance in the name of basically that Asian material, and they kind of feel like seize and become interested in Asian material. There is a reason why German become interested in that project, is that like in like European Renaissance project, what happened that it is more of basically the Greco-Roman and Franco connectivity. Actually, German has been considered as an barbaric actually within that discourses. So German has basically within that identity, it has a less connected with the European community, and in many ways they found it basically a melancholic experience themselves. So they wanted to basically make sense of their identity. So in order to confront that, they come up with basically that Oriental Renaissance ideas, and they kind of sees that basically that that probably like India is the past and the Germany is the future, and in many ways Europe. And that time that the development concept has gradually developed, actually, that some societies are basically past and eventually gradual development of that. But this Oriental Renaissance and great admiration has been challenged by some of the Enlightenment scholar, and that's very important to get into the how we perceive basically Chatushkodi in present days. One of them is basically Immanuel Kant. We are very much familiar with his work and ideas. He gave basically a series of lectures in 1800, and he said that on logic, that he thinks basically that ability to reason is one of the very important criteria how developed you are. And based on that ability, actually, he said that basically European are the basically the very advanced group of people, because they have the capacity to reason abstract. And other people might have a basic reasoning, actually. That time, because in William Jones and Colebrook's writing, actually, we came to know that basically there's a certain form of Indian reasoning, actually, the European scholar coming to know. So he said basically these are basically very elementary reasoning, and they are kind of a lower stage. And then we got basically other group of people. They are basically highly influenced by their sensual experience and other stuff. So these categorizing people based on reason, which is a very important in basically the colonial justification of the rule that the European is rational and we are irrational. That's one of the very important things basically. And when basically Max Muller, he translated Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and in the introduction, actually, he said basically that if the Gita is the early stage of human thinking, then the Immanuel Kant is a full flourished version of that. So he's kind of making a progressive connection, actually, that primitive Indian and the developed European. And the reason is basically the very important criteria for that. So what is that reason, actually, they are very much depending upon? Is that what we started with at the beginning, that rejection of contradiction, and many rejection of excluded middle. So contradiction is very important. So the whole identity is based on basically someone who is rational. He will reject the contradiction. And if you are basically contradicting yourself, then you are not rational. And in case of Chatushkodi, we find basically an example of third kodi, which is a blatant contradiction to some extent, some people might think. So that's, for obvious reason, it would be basically highly alienated. So what happened? The first European scholar who mentioned about the Chatushkodi is 1917. His name is Louis Devel Prussian. He gave basically a series of lectures on Nirvana in Manchester University. And what he said is very important, actually. He said the Indian people, it seems to be, don't have idea of contradiction. And I find myself, and then he could basically the Nirvana is not exist, exist, not exist. Nirvana is neither exist nor not exist, nor both neither not exist and both exist, and not neither exist or both exist. And he said basically I find myself hopeless basically in this whole situation. So the whole model actually first introduced the Chatushkodi to the European audience in a way actually that is kind of doesn't really make sense kind of a system. Whereas basically this system has traveled, as I have mentioned earlier, in the Greece and also the Far Eastern system. So, and then apparently in subsequent eras actually in the present in 20th century, there's a lot of other scholars appear to think basically that this is kind of a like Eastern mysticism, or some might have thought that basically the reason never basically spark in basically in 6th century in Magad. So these are the how the whole system has been perceived in the in many ways the 20th century academia. But over recently, the whole thing started to change when one of the dominant logician of our time, his name is Graham Priest, he kind of propagate different places of skill, the dialectism, there is his philosophical position. He thinks that dialectic is basically the true contradiction is possible. So since he's a very influential logician, he picked up this idea, brought it into the discussion of mainstream. So over the last 20 years, or probably more precisely, if I say basically last 10 years, you will see the huge spike of basically more scholarly, more logicians are getting engaged on this because of the Graham Priest is a very influential figure, and he brought that into the basically that mainstream discussion of logic, and he used this as an argument in favor of his system that true contradiction is possible. But whether there's a big question whether his interpretation is right or wrong. So this is how basically, and he said basically this is a one form of alta rationality. So it's kind of very interesting. From basically the journey of Chatushkoti actually started with basically 6th century as in like debate, from then turn out to basically as an philosophical method which both used as an by number of areas in Greece, also in India by Nagarjuna and Madhyamika philosophers, and also we see that is in China, Japan, and Tibet. On the other hand, actually, when we then subsequently we see basically it is treated as an irrational system, and people find it very hopeless situation. And at the end, someone is claiming that it's a very hyper-rational concept. There is in politics of othering, but we don't want to go to that discussion. But now question, how to make sense out of it? Because the obvious problem is, so the obvious problem, just going to that Tathagata's case actually, that when I say basically Tathagata's lives after death, when that question was asked, and Siddhartha responded, it is not so. And he doesn't think that basically Tathagata lives after that. So that's when I say that no, it necessarily means that basically it's implying to the second kothi, which is basically that Tathagata doesn't live after death. Because if we understand the meaning of nine here or no in here, on the other hand, when he was asked basically next question that Tathagata doesn't live after that, and he is saying that basically no again, which implies that basically if Tathagata doesn't live after that, this means that basically that Tathagata lives after that. It implies that. So how to make sense of no in this context? That's one of the very important aspects to understand the Chatushkoti rightly. And that problem has been kind of in many ways solved by one of the Nagarjuna's commentator. His name is Baba Vivek. And he wrote a text, it's called Pragyapadip. He's a 4th century commentator and philosopher. The text is lost and has been, it was translated in the Sanskrit text is lost, was translated in Tibetan. So we found it in Tibetan version of the text. And also same problem, actually same approach has been taken by the Chandrakirti in his our seminal text, most of us familiar with basically Prasannapada. And he also tried to solve the same way. So what I'm going to do actually next a few minutes to give basically a clue actually how to make sense out of it, how the traditional logician and thinker has tried to make sense of it. And then basically, if we had time, actually look at basically how modern concept of looking at it. So that one way of solving it actually is very embedded in our tradition, is that we have a different concept of negation. Like the one form of negation na is interpreted basically when it said true, then it implies if true, not true means false, not false means true. So this is one way of basically interpreting it. It's connected with each other. But there is another form of basically interpretation of now we like the two concept of negation we found it basically in early writings of the Paninis. Those two negation has been named Prashuddha and Prashodja Pratished. Pratished means negation, so I translated it into negation. So we got a Prashuddha negation and Prashodja negation. The Prashuddha is actually is fairly the way we currently understand negation. Like when you say not true means false, not false means true. This is how it's operate Prashuddha. But Prashodja is basically Patanjali given very contextual interpretation because he had a different reason. It's connected with the Mimamsa philosophy and other stuff. That suppose in the all the countries who somehow colonized by the Britain, we usually drive on the left side. So, and that's the rule actually. In order to get a license, you have to know that rule. Basically, you have to drive on that country, that left side, despite of the fact that Americans drive on the right. So, for suppose we are basically driving in India and driving on the left. I suppose in India, you guys are driving on the left. So, driving in the left. So that's the rules actually. And to get a license, you must know the rules. But sometimes that rules can be suspended. When basically there's a construction going on. So you might see basically that don't go on the left, go on the right side of the road because it has been suspended for the time being because the construction, it doesn't really mean you always have to drive on the right. It's just in this case, it has been suspended. So it has a very good implication and importance in basically interpreting some of the basically Vedic gnostic rituals and other stuff in the Purva-Mimamsa philosophy. And Patanjali many ways basically try to make sense of all some of the basically suspension of rules through this concept of negation. Baba Vivek, what he has done, he redefined this Prashodja negation in a slightly more refined way. And what he said basically that is very interesting. What we do when we negate some things. When we negate some things, we do two things. Firstly, when I say basically that I am here, I'm necessarily also saying that I'm not outside the room. So when I said I'm in this room, I'm necessarily also saying that I'm not outside the room. When I say I'm not outside the room, that is basically, that's implicit. So that implies, so when I say I'm in this room, so it implies that I'm not outside the room. That is called proponti. That's the term used by the Chandrakirti in his Prashnapada in interpretation of first verse of the Nagarjuna. He used that term. And when he used at the time the proponti, he said basically that the difference between Prashuddha and Prashodja negation is basically the cancellation of proponti, implication. So that's why sometimes this two negation is translated as an implicative and non-implicative. So in Prashuddha negation, when I say that I'm here, I'm in this room, it means that I'm not in this room also, I'm asserting that. But when I'm using Prashuddha negation, when I say basically that I'm not in this room, it doesn't, I'm saying basically I'm outside the room. So that Prashuddha implication has been chopped off. So now how to make sense of that actually, if we go back to the, sorry. So that's a problem. So if we look at the example actually, that we got the four kotis like all around, like the four. So the rejection is actually the rejection of basically four kotis each time is an working as a basically Prashodja negation, non-implicative. When Buddha or Nagarjuna or Pharaoh or basically the Jan is using basically Chatushkoti, what they are doing basically when say I mean Tathagata doesn't lives after death is not true, it means that they are only saying it is not true. They are not saying basically Tathagata lives after death is not true. Doesn't really means basically that he's asserting basically that Tathagata doesn't live after true. It's just only saying that, no more than that. Similarly, when they're basically saying that Tathagata does, like if someone asks Tathagata doesn't live after death, He's saying it is not the case that Tathagata doesn't live after death. It's just saying that this sentence is not true. He's not claiming anything else is true. So that's why it's a non-implicative concept of negation. And that's how it can give us a basically wider sense of the whole model of the Chatushkoti. And it has a basically, it has a very interesting aspect. Probably like someone who is basically currently connected with or familiar is basically that critical method of like Frankfurt School, or there's basically a critique of binary opposition, actually, a deconstructive method. In many ways, basically, this concept of negation, actually, like giving a very much systematic way of basically, you can criticize some things without saying that the negation is true. And that's very important. And we do sometimes in our day-to-day life, actually. We claim something is not right, and so, but we don't want to confirm that the negation is true either. So that's whole concept actually kind of a help, and also it help us basically to given basically like lots of other possible like when basically we are taking as a method actually that Aristotelian method like true and false has been considered. Now we got basically wider range of varieties. Like suppose basically is it going to be rain tomorrow? We don't know. So it is neither true nor false. If the mango is half ripped, is the mango is ripped yellow, is like yeah, is a half ripped. It could be basically partially yellow, partially green. So it gives you basically wider grip on the basically reality and addressing the issues. The Chatushkoti than the basically the system we highly used from the Aristotelian, actually the true false, the binary system. So this has a like wider. So that's kind of like what I wanted to cover, but maybe probably like if there is a question or something, maybe we can get into the further detail actually. Yeah, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Syed Nizar, for this wonderful talk. And I think I've really enjoyed the talk, given the extensive historical discussion, the background of the development of Chatushkoti, and its very subtle philosophical aspects. Very, very useful. Thank you so much for giving this talk. We have a few questions from the audience, which I would like to take up one by one. One of the first questions was asked by Choki Wangchuk. It was in Tibetan, and probably it said Gachi Bado, which I think means what does it mean or what does it exert. So probably he was trying to ask how do you make sense of early Buddhist logic. So probably you have already answered that question. So I take that the question is resolved. The next question was asked by Sorojit Ghosh, and his question is, Sayedji, how did Indo-Greco-Buddhism contributed towards exchange of philosophical ideas between Indo-Buddhist philosophy, Nagarjuna's philosophy especially, and Western philosophy, which is the Greco philosophy? Would you like to answer this question, Sayedji?
So, Kanda, like the Indo Buddhist is like, I suppose is like the Gandhari Buddhism actually. It is a like very interesting place in many ways. Is neither West nor East. It's kind of a both in many ways. It's probably the third Koti. Third alternative of the Chatushkoti. So it has kind of a like contributed in many ways actually in assimilation, is in discussion and many other stuff. Particularly that some of the things actually we see, like suppose in Kothabatu, like some of the question has been raised about the existence and inexistence of time. If this sort of debate actually wasn't in coming from the like Magadhi Buddhism, actually, more to be more specific, because the time in existence basically, like it wasn't like kind of a bigger problem in the basically like Zarathustrian, they have lots of philosophical aspect actually where the time has been considered. and the inexistence of time. And there actually that discussion was there. So kind of when Buddhism went to the Gandhar, actually, they kind of their own discussion, they have responded using this sort of methodology. It's a very interesting synthesis of synthesize of actually both tradition and at a time actually that could some of the interesting use of argumentation and other stuff actually, and expansion of Buddhist range of argument. And secondly, it plays a very important role actually to the sending idea to the basically Far East too. When we think of Gandhar, we very much think of basically like West and East, but it also connect basically India with the East to actually China and other aspect. We need to like take into the consideration. So this is how actually kind of contributed in many ways actually in engaging other aspects. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
But I'm not sure whether like he wanted to a particular like aspect of Nagarjuna he has having in mind. I'm not sure. Yeah. If
Right. I'm not sure if Surjit can sort of respond to that question, but he has another question that you might want to respond to. And he says that in many Buddhist sutras, we observe that the Tathagata replies in affirmation negation style. What could have been the motive of the early composers of texts to follow such a pattern?
I'm not clear what is affirmation negation style like in is
I think he probably means just the Chatushkoti Salavri when Buddha says that it exists and then he says it doesn't exist. So I think he's trying to ask you what was the motive of the early composers of text to follow such a pattern.
Oh, that's another very difficult aspect. Like that what I've been investigating for last few years. What are the early examples, and also basically that whether Buddha has used Chatushkoti as a method. Buddha never used Chatushkoti as a method. He used Dukoti as a method actually. That's why he said basically he avoided too extreme and we should go in the middle actually. There's a one person, we know basically there are like in Pali tradition, they usually means that basically lots of sutras have been given basically in like in a logical form. It's called Moha Kotikton. There's one of the follower of the early follower of the Siddhartha actually. He kind of like interested in this sort of style, but we'll never know actually that whether what sort of like the range of example we came across in the Pali Nika, especially in the Brahmajal Sutra, that whether like what sort of contribution that person have actually, and we wouldn't be able to never know. But Siddhartha never used Chatushkoti as a method actually. It is like kind of a coming from a slightly different tradition. And that's what I have been investigating over the few years. That usually it has been said that one of the contemporary of Siddhartha, his name is Sanjay Beltutto, like, and usually people claim that the Sanjay Beltutto is the person who has first time used Chatushkoti, and I kind of I was investigating actually that is it really the right or it is wrong. My kind of findings that it is wrong for many reasons. Firstly, only like in Pali Sumunapal Sutra mention about that when Bimbisha is the one of the king of Magad during the time of Buddha actually, and then Ajatashatru was his son who take over the power from him. Actually, he has it's mentioned that he has visited to the Sanjay, and Sanjay has said that basically Sanjay said, if you ask me basically if there is an like afterworld or Poroloko, then I would say basically that itipe no pipipe no and no pipipe no. So he's kind of like saying this sort of a very renowned aphorism. one of the thing is that there is a highly unlikely because we know basically that Ajatashatru has a significant contribution in early development actually of Buddhism. But we need to take into consideration that when Sonjo has died, Sonjo has died before Buddha first time come to the Magad, because when Bimbisha invited him, because Sonjo had quite a large number of basically follower, around probably 500, and half of them has joined to the Buddha Sangha actually, and also some of the sutras mentioned that Sonjo has died before Buddha has come over there. And we know that in many years later, Ajatashatru became the king. And in that sutra, it's apparently looked like basically that Sonjo is addressing Ajatashatru as a Maharaja, which is very unlikely because Ajatashatru wasn't be king that time actually, and most likely to be basically he never met with Sonjo, firstly. Secondly, I also investigated actually some of the parallels of those Pali Somnapal text, because the Pali Somnapal text has developed. McGuinness has a quite considerable interesting work actually. There's a lots of version of the Pali Somnapal sutras, and she has suggested that the whole sutra has developed between second, after the death of Buddha to the basically up to 2nd century. There's a number of Pali Somnapal sutra. And we also basically said Mula Sarvastivadin Binaya, we also have basically that certain version of it actually in Sanghabad Sutra. They never mention about basically that epigram. Secondly, we know basically that Pali Sutras is highly have been basically going through lots of transformation. And even in the time of basically Buddha Gosha, he has one of the very important commentator of the in Pali commentarial tradition actually. He in his one of texts, it appeared to basically mistreated, the logically mistreated that claim. And from there, actually, because he thought that there's a 5 sentences. In fact, there's a 6 sentences. And he thought that basically he's denying basically, when he's saying basically, I'm saying no to that, I'm saying no to that, I'm saying no to that. So he has interpreted basically that he's kind of rejecting basically by all the 4 corners. But in fact, he wasn't actually, because he is just denying the denial of denial at most. If we say that basically, when we say basically no to the no. So it's the last sentence. So it's kind of a denial. So it's kind of a build up on that whole idea that basically probably Sonjo has developed this idea is based upon basically kind of a misreading of the early text. And secondly, there is no authenticity of that epigram. Just to edit up, Aditya, actually, that what I was saying that early
Syed, we lost your voice, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yourself accidentally.
Hello, can you hear me now? Is it better? I think. Can you hear me now?
We just lost your voice.
That's true.
Just a minute. No. Can you hear me, Syed?
I can hear you.
Okay, now I can hear. Okay, perfect. Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So where was I don't know how far you guys have managed to listen.
No, it's